Selam millet, Karantina Days videolarının yepyeni bir bölümüyle daha karşınızdayım. Evet arkadaşlar, bugün sizlerle birlikte gene Game Teori'de inanılmaz güzel bir oyun teorisini inceleyeceğiz. Oyunumuzun adı Bendy and Ink the Machine. Ben 2 bölümünü oynadım bu oyunu. Bitirmedim. Türkçe yamasının çıkmasını bekledim ve bugün bir şey söyleyeyim mi? Bak, zaman da çok iyi. Niye biliyor musunuz? Şu an yapacağı teori büyük ihtimal henüz Bendy'nin daha 3-4-5 chapter'ları falan çıkmadan yapılmış bir teori olacak. Yani teknik olarak benim zaten oynadığım yere kadar teori yapacak ve bu gerçekten çok havlı. Şimdi hızlı bir şekilde başlayacağım. Bakalım Bendy. Bu arada Bendy ile alakalı bana gelip de ne biliyorsun diye sorsanız size derim ki hiçbir şey. Evet, size hiçbir şey derim. Hadi bakalım. Bu arada söylemeyi unuttum. Ben ne zaman Game Teori'nin videolarını izlesem bana bunun tıpatıp aynısının yapılmış Türkçe versiyonu var diyorsunuz ama size söylemem gereken bir değer var. Ben Met'i çok seviyorum, tamam mı? Bu adamın olayı işlemesini çok seviyorum ve gerçekten ya teorileri bu arkadaştan izlemek bence benim açımdan daha keyifli. Hey, Mark Clipper ekrana koyuyor bir kere. Pekala. Evet, bu arada 5 bölümden oluşuyor. Bak tam olarak söylediğim yer. İlk ikisi şu an hazır, üçüncüsü yolda diyor. Yani teori büyük ihtimal ilk ikisine göre, yani benim zamanında oynadığıma göre yapılacak. Ve bu çok havlı. Bu çıkışları hatırlıyorum. Kesinlikle.
And by putting the bits of lore together collected from audio logs sprinkled throughout the game, you learn that Joey was experimenting with ways of bringing his cartoon.
Oha! Bir dakika, bak şu an mesela bunu ben Matt'ten öğreniyorum. Karikatürleri, ya oradaki oyuncakları hayata geçirmeyi mi denedi? Ve deneyler başarılıydı.
Very dangerous. You also learn that some employees, like Sammy Lawrence, Joey Drew's music department director, worship these living cartoons as gods, forming what seems to be a good old-fashioned cult.
Şu an spoiler yiyor olabilirim, böyle bir sahne hatırlamıyorum.
For our Lord is calling to us, my little sheep. The time of sacrifice is at hand.
Besides Bendy, there's also Boris the Wolf walking around, and Bendy's girlfriend Alice Angel, who looks like she'll be playing a bigger part in Chapter 3. And honestly, that's about it for now. Now, many of you have been asking me on Twitter, @MattPatGT, as well.
Bak nasıl araştırıyor, işte bu herifin bu araştırma ruhuna bayılıyorum.
To try and predict what's going on. But after doing the research, I think I can do you one better. Instead of just trying to put together.
Bak abi, Wiki'ye giriyor. Wiki'ye girersin bro.
I can reveal the true identity of the main character of the game. Joey Drew, the mastermind animator obsessed with bringing his creation.
Altyazı gene çok leş gibi ama bir şey söyleyeyim mi? Buna değer. Gerçek bir insandan mı? Bunu büyük ihtimal 2. Dünya Savaşı sonrasına bağlayacak.
Pioneer of animated entertainment, a man whose name has sadly been almost completely forgotten by history, a man by the name of Max Fleischer.
Max Fleischer.
Bendy and Boris, you probably immediately think of Walt Disney and the old Mickey Mouse cartoons. I mean, we're all trained to think that Walt Disney was the pioneer of this style of animation, that he's the guy who made cartoons into what they are today, but that's because he purposely planted those thoughts into your head. And that's not an exaggeration. If you read about Walt Disney, you start to learn that he was a master of marketing himself, taking credit for things that weren't his idea to begin with and using the media to sell his story to listeners who didn't know any better. No, if you're looking for the true masterminds responsible for helping to shape the early world of animation, it was Max Fleischer, with his brother Dave Fleischer working from their animation studio in New York.
Fleischer stüdyoları. Dostum.
Way back in 1914, when Walt was still only a teenager, Max Fleischer invented rotoscoping, a technique that allowed an artist to trace over live-action footage to create more realistic-looking animated movements. This was a huge advancement, allowing cartoons to be drawn faster and with a higher quality of movements. It also gave rise to the first of the major Fleischer Brothers series known as Out of the Inkwell.
Inkwell mi?
Live-action footage of Max was combined with his animated characters as they literally came to life off the page to interact with and explore the real world. But the Fleischers didn't stop there. Ask anyone what the first cartoon to feature synchronized sound and music was, and they'll usually say Steamboat Willie, Mickey Mouse's monumental debut from back in 1928.
1928.
Max, not Walt Disney, who was the first to combine sound and animation in his series of shorts called Song Cartoons back in 1924, 4 years earlier than Steamboat Willie. These were those famous Follow the Bouncing Ball sing-alongs that you've probably seen or heard of. Well, you have Max Fleischer to thank for those. But according to rumors, when Steamboat Willie launched, Walt Disney, despite being 4 years late to the party, actively tried
Nasıl
to
bütün
discourage
sektörü ele aldı?
from mentioning these past sound videos in their articles, thus allowing Disney to claim all the credit for being the first to use these techniques.
Evet.
Thus began the animation feud with the Disneys on the West Coast in Hollywoodland, going up against Max and his brother back east in New York. An animation feud that would last in the industry for the next 2 decades. At their prime, the Fleischer Studio would be a premier producer of animated cartoons for theaters, with Walt Disney Productions being their chief competition. And yet, as I'm sure you can guess, it was the Disney.
Disney kazanır tabii. Böyle bir versus her zaman Disney kazanır.
California, amongst the growing
What the
movie industry,
fuck?
ultimately buried Fleischer's business and erased his name from the annals of
Ben bu arada sen söyleyene kadar bilmiyordum bile. Evet, bunun bu arada Bendy ile ne ilgisi var?
Even with animation in its infancy, Max Fleischer's work with Out of the Inkwell was literally bringing animated
Gerçek dünyaya getirme olayıyla bağlaştıracak büyük ihtimal.
A man who literally wrote a book on bringing images to life, as we see in Chapter 1's The Illusion of Living. It's also clear that Joey Drew's animation studio has fallen to ruin by the time your character visits it, a detail that reflects Max Fleischer's eventual bankruptcy, ultimately losing his business to Walt Disney, the man who stole the credit from him.
At this point, I don't get what Joey's plan is for this company. The animation sure aren't being finished on time anymore.
Think about it. If this game was truly meant to parallel Walt Disney animation, then why would it happen in an abandoned studio? And why would the characters be out for revenge? I mean, Disney
şimdi anlamaya başladım. Dur bakalım.
Max Fleischer was the one who was left with a crumbling business and a name lost to obscurity. So if there's anyone out there who would have a chip on their shoulder and be out for revenge, like you see Joey Drew and Bendy in the Ink Machine, well, it would be him. But we're not even to the good stuff yet. One look at Bendy's design and I'm sure you immediately think of Mickey Mouse, right? Small, mischievous character.
Evet, benziyor biraz. Evet.
Fleischer had his version of the character too. Bimbo, a tubby black and white cartoon dog complete with big...
Oha, sen var ya çok iyi yapıyorsun bu işi ya. Gerizekalı, çok iyisin. Tamam, güzel benzettim bu arada. Evet, Mickey her zaman iyidir. Bimbo ise baş belası. Çaldığın tavuklar. Çalmıyorum.
He's constantly chasing women and pulling pranks. Bimbo's behavior just seems to be the stronger match for what you'd expect from a little devil like Bendy.
Bimbo ile Bendy'yi şu an
just with Bimbo. There's also a direct relation between Max's real-life characters and Bendy's girlfriend Alice Angel. Now admittedly we don't know too much about Alice. She was just introduced.
Alice hakkında fazla bir şey bilmiyorsun değil mi? Ben de bilmiyorum kanka. Lütfen devam etme o yüzden.
She appears to be a female devil creature like Bendy who somehow became an angel, like a Looney Tunes-esque Lucifer who happens to sing. We also know that she's drawn to be beautiful. Not only does she just physically look pretty, but she's also wearing a tight black halter-top dress. Something that, back during this era of animation, would have been seen as sexy and scandalous. We also know via the audio logs that Sammy Lawrence expects her to surpass Bendy's popularity.
İnsanlar şimdi gerçekten Melis'in sesini duyuyor gibi görünüyor. Sammy bir gün kıvrımlar kadar popüler olabileceğini söylüyor.
Long story short, this ain't your mama's Minnie Mouse, but it is your mama's Betty Boop, one of the Fleischer's famous creations.
Gene Fleischer stüdyoları.
She's a singer who was introduced into the cartoons to be Bimbo's love interest, surpassed him to become way more popular, and was considered to be an attractive, sexy character back in the day. So much so, in fact, that her design had to be toned down in 1934 when the government started cracking down on the sexual content in films. Oh yeah, and she also happens to wear black halter-top dresses. Well, eventually red, but, you know, this is black and white cartoon. And if you're wondering how a human woman would become the love interest of a cartoon dog, well, get this. Betty Boop actually started as a dog. A French poodle, in fact. It's kind of disturbing, really. Her long dog ears became her long hoop earrings. Ugh, it's kind of gross. Anyway, she's also the matching species of her love interest, just like the Ink Machine's two little devils. But it's stylistically where we see these two worlds collide the most. During Fleischer's war against Disney, two styles of animation developed. Disney's West Coast style was much more family-friendly, with characters behaving much more realistically and in settings that happen to be brighter and cheery.
Evet,
The New York
dostum.
style, Max's work was much grittier, twisted, aimed at more mature audiences with character bodies contorting like rubber bands. It was a looser animation style that felt like improv, where characters aren't so tight.
Oha, çok iyi lan. Şu anda değindiği nokta çok iyi.
Like the YouTube animations that you see from channels like Gonzo SSM, Psychic Pebbles, Oni
Hey, bunu
Ninja,
Three Friends'e bağlama da.
The settings were grungier, taking place in cities and sewers, inside buildings rather than outdoors, and the topics dealt with were racier. Just like Betty Boop, a character made to be a sex symbol that has literally persisted across generations.
Dostum.
In short, these were scarier cartoons with dark,
Evet.
sometimes even hellish imagery, and this is the aesthetic that seems to embody the game. Joey's animation studio is a tight, confined space filled with
Dar bir
industrial
alan.
pipes and dripping ink, dark and shadowy. It's literally a hell on earth. And yet, for all the jump scares, what's creepiest in the game right now is the cult. The big reveal that ends Chapter 2 is that Sammy is trying to sacrifice you to their ink god, Bendy. He's clearly in a cult worshipping these living, breathing cartoon characters. But in this case, truth is actually stranger than fiction, because there's an unexplained recurring theme of cult activity throughout the Fleischer Studio roster. In Betty Boop Is My Palm Red, we see Bimbo and Coco the Clown worshipping a shadowy witch figure. A shadow, mind you, that never gets
Oha!
explained. It's not a joke in any way. They're just there, bowing to it, and presumably it gives Bimbo his fortune-telling powers. Then there's Betty Boop Red Hot Mama, where a fireplace suddenly, for literally no reason, transforms into the literal mouth of hell. Also, let me just say how creepy it is that every Betty Boop cartoon...
Şu çizgi film serisini izlemek istiyorum ya.
...sort of strong backlight so you can see her legs through the dress. I mean, come on guys, find a magazine or something. Here we all thought that anime was creepy. But perhaps the single most disturbing, bizarre, inexplicable example of this is in the cartoon Bimbo's Initiation.
Bimbo başlangıcı karikatürü.
Bimbo gets locked in the sewer by Mickey Mouse. Max clearly showing his grudge against Disney there.
Oha, çok iyi.
Confronted with a bunch of cultists. No joke, actual cultists asking him,
Want to be a member?
Üye olmak ister misin? Üye olmak ister misin? Hayır.
Bimbo refuses, he suddenly tortures
Hani her türlü korkunç cezayla işkence görür.
including a knife cutting through a sleeping room to stab
Dostum. Aa!
Want to be a member? Want to
Üye
be a
olmak ister misin? Üye olmak ister misin?
Over and over again he's asked to join until he's finally had enough punishment and says yes.
Evet
And
dediğinde?
it's revealed that the cult is made up entirely of Betty Boops. What the? What? What? So are you saying Betty Boop created a bunch of clones? That there's a cult that worships herself? Or maybe you're saying that when a stranger
Dostum.
asks you to join a cult, you should absolutely say yes because there's gonna be a hot girl in it for you. Regardless, it's weird and it's creepy and I have no idea how people back in the early 30s found it funny, but I think this scene gives us a really strong indication of what's going on in Bendy and the Ink Machine. So in the words of Good Mythical Morning, let's talk about that. Between the gritty setting, the failing company, the desire to bring cartoons to life, the mischievous white-gloved mascots and matching female partners, a boss with a chip on his shoulder, and the recurring cult imagery, there is little to no doubt that Max Fleischer is, in fact, the real-life Joey Drew. So then what? What's all this mean for the game? What's the point of doing this? Well, if this theory proves true, first we'll see Alice take center stage as the game goes on. Like
Alice ne olduğunu bilmiyorum. Serinin sonraki filmleri, oyunlarını oynamadım.
Bendy, and you can expect Bendy probably won't be too happy about that, creating some infighting between the characters with you stuck in the middle. I'd also hazard to guess that we haven't seen the last of that cult. Just like we saw in Bimbo's Initiation, how intense would it be to learn that these characters are using the Ink Machine to replicate themselves, building a cult consisting of hundreds of horror Bendy and Alice clones.
Mürekkep makinesini açıklıyor şu an.
It wouldn't surprise me to see Joey Drew as the real identity behind the first Bendy, fused together with his creation by the cursed Ink Machine, literally consumed with his desire to bring cartoons to life, just like Max Fleischer desired to bring his cartoons to life, and was eventually consumed by his desire to get revenge on Disney.
Wow.
I guess we'll just have
Ama
to
sadece bir teori mi kanka?
find out. But in the meantime, remember, that's just a theory.
Just a theory. Bir şey söyleyeyim mi? Çok güzel. Oğlum şu an var ya 3'ü
Wanna be a member? Wanna be a member? Then click subscribe.
Güzel bağlamışsın. Ben de sorayım sana o zaman. Üye olmak ister misiniz? Bence like atın bu videoya. Bu videoya. Arkadaşlar oğlum. Şu an Bendy ile alakalı kafamda bayağı şey oluştu ve bahsettiği şeyleri bilmiyordum. Gerçekten bilmiyordum bu arada. Yani dostum tamam. Bu arada şifreler gelecek. Haberiniz olsun, şifreler gelecek. Şifreleri internette birileri paylaşmaya başlamış. Bu benim için bir sorun teşkil etmiyor. Ama dediğim gibi şifreleri bir yerde görmeniz veya şey yapmanız bir önemi yok. Sadece 5 kişinin çözebileceği şifreler bunlar, unutmayın. Kendinize çok iyi bakın. Sizi çok seviyorum. Hoşça kalın.